and I am the computational social science lead at CCAI, Climate Change AI. We are delighted to welcome everyone joining us today across countries and time zones to attend CCAI's webinar on machine reading the growing climate impacts and adaptation literature with our distinguished speakers today, Dr. Rupam Shukla and Dr. Max Callahan. Before we dive in, I want to briefly introduce CCAI. And so we're going to share a few sort of tidbits about CCAI. We are an organization, international organization that is catalyzing impactful work at the intersection of climate change and AI. This is a global network of researchers, policymakers, and stakeholders, and a set of digital resources for working in this area. We provide advice for relevant stakeholders and also organize events for knowledge sharing, just like this one. And we have a whole host of conferences and events which we organize that are paired with a variety of sort of existing conferences on machine learning and also climate science. And all of this information is also available online, so you can access the video recordings from these prior events at our website. And you can also search through all these accepted papers from CCAI events using a keyword search that's super helpful at the climatechange.ai website. If you're interested in connecting with other people who are active in the space, you should definitely check out the Climate Change AI community. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of fun topics to follow. And again, it's a great way of just networking and connecting with other folks in this space. And as a part of that, we also have a directory where you can add yourself and list sort of your profile and connect with other people who are interested in similar topics. So this is a great way of putting yourself out there and also finding other folks who are active in this space. And you can also read in-depth write-ups on the CCAI blog. This is a very sort of accessible short form format where you can learn about applications of AI and machine learning that are sort of emerging. It's a great way of just sort of getting an overview of what's going on in this space as well. And if you're interested in kind of looking up different knowledge and tool sets, you should definitely check out the wiki. This is a great sort of community-driven repository of information where you can gain additional insight about what's going on. And so last but not least, you should definitely sign up for the newsletter where you can learn more about calls for funding and exciting projects and potential job opportunities that are also cropping up in this space. Okay, so with that, we also organize a whole set of webinars and happy hours as well. These are just opportunities to learn more about different sort of advances and also to connect with other folks in a more sort of informal way. So check out the CCAI website to engage with other folks. And with that, we will sort of switch over to today's theme. And, I think it's safe to say there are hundreds of thousands of scientific papers about climate change. And this volume has, ballooned to an extent that there are actually so many papers out there that we could spend multiple lifetimes just attempting to parse through them. But of course, we rely on synthesis across distributed teams to broach this challenge. And we, essentially have to rely on these large-scale assessments that are increasingly intractable as means of synthesizing evidence for science generally and also within climate science specifically. And this also pertains to the IPCC, that there's such a huge sort of volume of knowledge that it becomes difficult to synthesize it. And it raises some interesting questions. What are the prospects of using new tools like NLP and machine learning to read through this rising ocean of knowledge? What are the risks and limitations of this approach, the promises and perils that are associated? Can such a machine learning assisted approach help us to answer some of the most pressing climate adaptation questions, including the most fundamental ones. Are adaptations actually reducing the risks of climate hazards? How can we mobilize equitable climate adaptation globally? To help us think through these critical questions, I'm excited to introduce both of our speakers today. First, Dr. Rupam Shukla, Assistant Professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. She is a former postdoctoral researcher at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany, and her research focuses on vulnerability, resilience, and adaptation to climate risks, and understanding the human dimension of climate change. She was a contributing author to IPCC AR6, Working Group 2, and Chapter 16 that focused on synthesizing the evidence on aspects of equity and adaptation responses. And today she will present on the big literature challenge, learning from a global stocktake of research on climate adaptation. After Dr. Shukla, we will hear from Max Callahan, Dr. Max Callahan from the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. Dr. Callahan is a researcher in the Applied Sustainability Sciences Working Group, applying quantitative methods to interpret large collections of scientific research, so-called big literature, about climate change. And given the big literature challenge, he will discuss various computational approaches from NLP and machine learning and how they can assist us in identifying and mapping this extensive literature, and how machine learning can help to streamline labor-intensive processes involved in synthesizing the science of climate change and climate change impacts and adaptation. So thanks both for joining us today to present on machine reading the growing climate science and adaptation literature. And the floor is yours, Dr. Shukla.
Thanks a lot, Kelton. I will now start to share my screen. Just a heads up that it's visible and I'm audible.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm grateful and thankful to Climate Change AI for inviting me here in the webinar series and present about my learnings from some of the research that I've been involved in understanding and synthesizing the global literature on climate adaptation. Yeah. So moving forward in these 20 minutes, I will give a brief introduction about myself, though, yeah, Kelton, you've given a very nice introduction already, but just a little bit overview of where I'm coming from, where I've been, and where I'm currently, what I'm doing currently. And then I'll introduce GAMI, which is the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, which is a collaborative effort by many climate change adaptation scientists led by Professor Leah. And after this, I will talk about how GAMI has synthesized a lot of literature using machine learning approaches, guided machine learning approaches, and synthesized and collected a corpus of literature which we have worked on. And then based on this literature, we have tried to understand some of the fundamental questions of climate adaptation in terms of what are we adapting to, where are we adapting, and what are the responses that we have to these hazards or climate risks that we are facing right now. And are these responses incremental or transformational in nature? And how does these, address the questions of social equity? Is it considered in which social group is considered in these responses? And then moving to a more, I wouldn't say broader, but a very fundamental question on, how do we classify adaptation in terms of should we classify it in dichotomous category of autonomous or planned, or is it more like a continuum? And then finally, I'll conclude with the challenges that I feel or I understand while working with the machine learning synthesized literature in synthesizing and as well as measuring climate adaptation. Okay, a little bit about myself. I did my master's, and you would see these color-coded geographic region here. I did my master's in climate science and policy from India. And then I did my PhD also in India in the Himalayan region, where I looked at the differential vulnerability of agriculture communities to climate risk. And then during my PhD time, I got an opportunity to visit Germany, and as an Erasmus plus student, PhD exchange student, and I was there for a little while. And after that, after finishing my PhD, I got an opportunity to be a postdoc at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. I was working in the working group Adaptation in Agriculture Systems, and some of my focus area during this time, it moved beyond Indian Himalayan region and then focused on African countries such as Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, and Ghana. And then now I moved back to India, and I've joined as an assistant professor at the Center of Excellence in Disaster Mitigation and Management at IIT Roorkee. Okay, now moving forward with the Global Adaptation Mapping Initiative, which we call as GAMI. So the GAMI initiative was, conceptualized in response to the need of IPCC AR6 report, which was going to come, in order to synthesize the adaptation literature systematically and in a way that, we address these fundamental questions. So this was organized by a coordination team, which was led by Professor Leah, as I already said, and you can see all the coordination team members here, and Max is also on the board. So I'm happy that he will be talking. We'll be hearing from him after my talk. And then there was a group of advisory team who guided the whole initiative and set up the protocol and how things could be coded, how things could be synthesized. And then there was a screening team, and then there were a collaborative volunteering coding team of I guess 180 coders, which volunteered their time, and they really coded these articles extensively and also intensively to make sure that we get the evidence in the way that we have to report. And this has led to a Nature climate change publication. A lot, one could read it. As you see, all the co-authors and all the coders are there. It's a long list. And it was a very collaborative effort. And for someone like me coming from an early career, being early career and maybe from Global South, it has been a great learning experience for me to collaborate and get an opportunity to be with such amazing authors. So what GAMI, like I said, what the intent was, it was to synthesize literature on, or systematically review the literature on climate adaptation. And this was done by a crowdsourcing efforts by adaptation researchers. What was done was that a database was created for initial screening, and which had more than 48,000 articles. Machine learning algorithms were used to screen these articles initially. And then I will talk a little bit about the process in the coming slides. And then the main aim was for the identification of key priorities for global adaptation assessment. Yeah. So how was the review or the selection of these articles done? There were code text queries which were run on Web of Science, Scopus, and Medline. These are three big places where most of the peer-reviewed articles are hosted. And then the idea was to assemble climate adaptation literature from 2013 to 2019, because that's the period of reporting for IPCC AR6. And then what the intent was to document and report adaptations that was being taken by the only humans. So other ecosystem responses or other kind of responses were not included, but only responses that were being taken up or led by humans was something that was included. Then, like I said, supervised machine learning algorithms were used to filter and prioritize these articles. Then the machine learning was also assisted by manual screening, and manual assistance was also given, and this was matched. In the end, 1,682 articles were selected for final coding. I guess Max, maybe he will talk a little bit more about this, but So I was not in the process of in this review process. What I've done in my work is that I've worked with these selected articles, and I've tried to synthesize and come up and answer some of these questions, and assist other co-authors in synthesizing, the information that we get from these articles. Okay, now moving to where are we adapting and what are we adapting to? So based on the synthesis, we found that there is a lot of adaptation reporting. Of course, there was, as you saw, there were 48,000 papers that were first initially found based on the code search query that was done. So there's a lot of growing literature on climate adaptation in different sectors, in different regions. So that's there. But a lot of literature is coming, as you can see from the slide here, is coming from Asia and Africa. And food sector and poverty sector has dominated most of, it's most dominant. And just as a cautionary, so a lot of our the findings that we have is also biased from food and poverty sector. And then the hazards that, as you see here in the lower column. So hazards, again, most of the responses are in Africa and Asia, just saying the same thing again. But drought and general climate change is something that a lot of our responses are focused to, then flooding and a little bit of heat waves. But these are the most dominant ones. So as one would, I would see this graph and assume that, there's a lot of adaptation happening in Africa and Asia. So maybe things are improving in these regions, or that's where the need is and that's where the funds are going. But when we went a little deeper, it was a little different from what these general numbers were telling us. So like I said, going a little deeper, we wanted to understand from this data, we wanted to understand that whether these responses are incremental, they're just continuing with the system that is in place, or is it transformational? Is it really, building the capacity of people and leading them to a different state and making sure that, there are more benefits. So the identification or classification of transformational adaptation was based on 4 factors. One was the depth of the action that was being taken, depth in terms of, the novelty of the response that is there. Then there was scope in terms of the geographic focus of the response that is there, or the sectoral, multi-cross sectoral focus of the response that is there. And then speed in terms of how much time has gone into implementation. And then the 4th aspect was added, which was new to the original classification that was given by Termeer, which was limits. So as you can see here, so these are the 4 factors: depth, scope, speed, and limits. Limits was something whether these responses can have or are overcoming the limits that are known to us. So what one could see from here, like I said, in Africa and in Asia, there was a lot of response that was happening, but none of these responses have evidence of high transformation. They're all low in their transformational capacity. So it's all incremental in nature. And maybe as we're realizing that, incremental adaptation is maybe it's not going to limit, or it's not enough for the kind of changes that we are facing. So transformational is what we needed, and that is something that is recommended also. So that's not happening in Africa and Asia, but in some parts of South and Central America, in some sectors, it's medium in terrestrial and water sector, and in some parts of North America and Europe as well. But where things are needed most in the global South, things are not so transformational. Then the second question that after doing the first, when the outcome of the first paper came, then a subset of researchers, this question was led by Malcolm and Kripa. So they both were really interested in understanding how much how does these responses, how do they account or address social equity, and which vulnerable groups some like 8 vulnerable groups were identified. Which vulnerable groups are these responses addressing? So as you can see here is the map showing the global distribution of whether a vulnerable group which is identified, which could be, there were 8 identified vulnerable groups. One was women, low income, disabled, and sorry, I'm missing on all of these 8, but one could see here. So low income, women, indigenous, elderly, youth, migrants, and disabled. So whether any of these vulnerable groups are addressed either in planning or implementation stage. So we segregated the responses and in planning and implementation, and then we tried to see whether there is an integration of vulnerable group. And one could see as it's reported, one could notice here again, Africa and Asia, there is more, from the global numbers, it seemed that there's more integration of equity consideration, or more integration of vulnerable group and higher equity consideration. But because a lot of, like I said in the start, because a lot of studies are focused in poverty and food sector, that is one reason that these numbers are coming higher. Okay, so in terms of regions, Africa is where a lot of integration of marginal groups was seen, and Europe and Australasia was something which were low, which ranked lowest. And then again in the sectors, poverty and oceans and food were ranked higher, and low income group were ones who were most integrated in these responses. One of the findings that is also reported in IPCC and with very high certainties that we are doing rather limited in terms of integrating disabled population and making sure that the responses or adaptation responses are addressing their needs. So that was one of the findings that came out very strongly from this analysis. Yeah, okay. Now, while we were doing this equity analysis, we had another question in mind that, how does these equity consideration change when we change the response type? So if most of these equity considerations are coming in autonomous adaptation or they're coming in planned adaptation, because these are the two very broad or dominant approaches of classifying adaptation. So we started and we tried to classify the responses in these two categories. And then we had this question of whether, the responses that we have, are they dichotomous in space, or is it more of a continuum? And when we saw from this, what we understood was that if you're trying to classify these selected articles into whether it's autonomous or planned, depending on a lot of, we came up with a definition in terms of who is implementing it, who is initiating it, are local actors involved, is it multi-sectoral, what is the intent? So if the intent is to, if it's a deliberate action taken by an external agent, we called it planned adaptation. And then if it was something that was led by individuals who were getting affected directly by a climate risk, their livelihoods were getting affected, we called it autonomous. But these two dichotomous, or these two categories, we weren't able to fit all the articles in these two categories. And then there was another category that we we call it, happened to chance upon, was this mixed category. That's the name that that came to our mind. So it has a component of both planning and autonomy of the actors. So as you can see here, overall in the food sector, so overall what we found was that out of the 682 articles that we had, 31% of the, or 35% of the articles were classified as mixed. So it was a great proportion. Most of it was autonomous. It was dominated by autonomous, but still there was a great proportion of mixed that we found. And then we tried to understand how this mixed category is playing out in different regions and across different sectors. So the food sector is dominated by autonomous action in many parts, in many regions, whereas the cities are dominated mostly by planned action. So this is something which was a little intuitive to us, because let's say in food sector, farmers were reported the most, and they were doing a lot of autonomous, or let's say many a times autonomous response is also labeled as coping. They were also doing a lot of coping responses, but they had a great agency that we found, and they were doing a lot of things on their own. And then what we could understand from this was that there is a continuum. These are not like separate ends of the spectrum, but rather the two are integrating in many ways now. There's a bit of, so a lot of things are happening in a bundled space where the two act together, but there's a lot of interaction otherwise going on. Sometimes the autonomous drives the planned adaptation. Sometimes the planned adaptation is enabling autonomous, and it's being sustained by autonomous action. So we classified all these 1600 and 82 projects into these different categories and these different typologies, and we are now trying to put up a paper together, which is led by me, Gina, and Kripa. And yeah, we hope to submit it soon and then share it with all of you. So based on what my learnings are from synthesizing the global literature on climate adaptation, what I feel is that, machine learning assisted selection, because the corpus that we were working with was also in a way guided by machine learning algorithms. It is actually giving us, it has the potential or is already galvanizing adaptation globally. It is making us aware about journal patterns or big gaps that exist in climate adaptation literature, such as in terms of, where the funds are going, where who is being considered, who is being excluded, what is happening globally. So that kind of understanding is something which is coming out very nicely when we use these kind of global synthesis, and that is, I feel, that is also required at this moment when we are trying to make sure that adaptation is placed in a space where it's funded accurate, effectively, and there's enough funds to make sure that vulnerabilities are not being is not only being reduced, but also make sure that they are not being you know they're not increasing in any way. Yeah, but what I feel that when working with the data that came from machine learning assisted selection, and anyway and also working with very local data, what I understand is that climate change adaptation is a very complex process. So just working with literature, sometimes it becomes a little yeah, I wouldn't say restrictive, but it the potential to answer some of the nuanced questions is limited. And also climate change adaptation is dynamic. So what happens when we are looking at one time static data, or we are looking at one paper, the response that the dynamicity of the response, that is something that is missed there, that is not being accounted for. So these are the two things, and that makes the whole process a little challenging in inherently. That's what I understand. And then when we are reading through the papers, there are a lot of disconnected terminologies in terms of what vulnerability is meant or is being assessed in one paper is different from how vulnerability is defined and assessed in another paper. So there are there one has to complement, or one has to standardize these methodologies and these terminologies to make sure that we are really synthesizing things in an accurate way. Then again, like I said, because climate change adaptation is dynamic, there is an delay that is there in when we implement the response and when the realization of risk happen. So if we're trying to, if the question is to understand whether adaptation is actually ensuring risk reduction, that will take a lot of time, and we need to have that kind of selection of literature to make sure that, we select literature based where this dynamism or time or longitudinal data is considered, then cross-sectional data. And then one of the biggest biases that I feel is something that comes is in the reporting of what's being reported in literature, and also what we code when we are trying to synthesize this literature. So there's a lot of value judgment that comes in. What is deemed important for me while I'm reporting or writing my paper or while I'm coding is something that becomes intuitively, it becomes a bias. So there has to be a mechanism to check it. There are ways to do coder reliabilities. This has also been done in all the papers that I just talked about. But still, I feel there maybe machine learning can assist in some ways. So therefore, I'll conclude by saying that, for understanding climate change adaptation, more fine-grained data extraction is needed. And I'm very hopeful that AI and ML can further, of course, it has helped a lot in synthesizing and making sure that the time that we spend in selecting the literature, that is reduced. But maybe if more fine-grained data extraction is something that could be the next step. And that's why I'm really looking forward to Mac's talk next, because he's going to talk about some more advanced methods such as NLP. And so I'm happy to hear and how one can take this forward. Thanks a lot. And I would like to also take this opportunity to thank our GAMI sub team. So GAMI is a big team of many adaptation researcher, but I've got the opportunity to work a little more extensively with subgroup, and there are a set of amazing researchers and people who represent multiple geographies and expertise, and we're all trying to understand and characterize adaptation. And a special thanks to Gina, Kripa, and Katie. They've been, really, we are in continuous discussion, and they're like, making sure that I understand some bit of climate adaptation. So I'll be happy to take questions during the Q&A, and if some of them are unanswered, please feel free to write to me. And also maybe we can follow each other on Twitter. So that's a nice way to connect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. I am sharing my screen now, and I'm happy to follow up with some, hopefully I can provide some details of some of the ways we applied machine learning in the GAMI project, but also talk about a broader research agenda that I've been following, that I followed in my PhD, which had the title Machine Reading the Science of Climate Change. And what I want to begin with is the context, which Kelton already mentioned, which is that the number of papers about climate change is increasing to proportions that make things simply difficult to do as we did them before. So the IPCC is supposed to provide comprehensive assessments of the literature, and it has been providing these assessments since the 90s, or since the beginning of the 90s. And at the beginning, in the first assessment reports, there were a few thousand papers to be assessed. And now there are hundreds of thousands of papers per assessment cycle. And I think this is a really big challenge, and it implies that we have to do things a little bit differently. The same for evidence synthesis in general. We rely on evidence synthesis, but they're similarly challenged by this huge growth in literature. So I just want to talk through in this presentation 3 different types of tasks that we have, and the 3 different ways that NLP can help. So we have the question of finding the literature that is relevant. So this is how machine learning was used in the GAMI project. So we want to basically separate one class of documents from another, and we say, okay, these documents are relevant and these documents aren't. Let's find a way to classify this. Another broader set of questions is asking what that literature is about. And we can either do this in an unsupervised way, where we're discovering the thematic structure, or in a supervised way, where we have a kind of already existing typology and we want to classify these documents into the known categories. So I'll talk through some practical applications of NLP for meta-learning from climate science in this presentation, talk about some methodological developments for using machine learning evidence synthesis, and also try and provide some reflections on the division of labor between humans and machines here. So first to the this process of which there's a large literature on active learning for systematic review screening. So this is what we used in the GAMI project. And basically what we have is that if we have lots of documents that we need to screen, so let's say here we have 1,000 documents and 100 of them are relevant. If we screen these by hand, and here screening means looking at a document and including it or not including it, we will see 95% of all relevant documents after we've seen 95% of relevant documents. But if we can use a kind of particular case of active learning, which is referred to as researcher in the loop, then we can provide, we can make it more likely that a researcher is going to see a document that's already relevant, and we can see 95% of relevant documents before we've seen all of the documents. So this is really nice. But there are some problems with how this is approached in the literature, actually. So there was a quite prominent paper last year in Nature Machine Intelligence where, and I don't want to criticize one particular paper in particular, but rather a kind of trend in these papers where the validation that's done isn't consistent or isn't sufficient to use these systems in the wild. So they have, here are some results from their study where they show basically what happens if they run that system on some data sets that they already have. But the problem, and you know, they achieve really good work savings. But if you didn't know how many relevant results there were to begin with, then you wouldn't be able to, you wouldn't know what the correct scale was on this y-axis. And so you wouldn't know when to stop. And this is a really, really big problem, because you might say, okay, we just stop when we see many irrelevant documents in the row, but there are local times when that happens, where we haven't reached this threshold. So we did a piece of work where we, and so first of all, there are some suggestions for how to approach this. But in a piece of work that we published in 2020, we showed that these can have really disastrous consequences. So if you, first, one thing that people do is they take a sample of the documents, then they get an estimate of how many are relevant. But the problem is if you overestimate that, then most of the time you will save absolutely zero work. And some of the time you will save work, but you'll miss your recall target by huge amounts. And this is the same with heuristics based on irrelevant documents in the row. And I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that we can use ML systems and validate them in certain contexts, but that doesn't mean that using them in other contexts where we don't have the information to validate them is appropriate. And what we developed was a simple test which treats the previously labeled documents as if they're a random sample of the remaining documents, in order to assess the probability that enough relevant documents to remain unseen to mean that a given recall target is missed. So here we see some examples from our data set, from our empirical examinations, where we see recall go to 95%, and subsequently the p-score for our null hypothesis that we've missed the target go down. And this works when the machine learning is working well. And here, where the machine learning is working not so well, we don't start stopping too early. Actually, this works more than 95% of the time. And so what the point of this research is to say that real-world applications of machine learning need careful validation. And yeah, we need to be careful about just saying there are big potentials and we can use these systems uncritically. So the next bit of work that we looked at was trying to find what the literature is about. So in this broad sense, when we have large and diverse corpora, unsupervised learning, such as topic modeling, can map the literature on climate change. And because the structure is not imposed by humans, the structure can be less subject to human biases. So here's an example of some of the results from the paper. Previously, we'd had some people had expressed some opinions about the balance of social science and other types of other sciences in the IPCC, saying that because the number of the proportion of papers in the IPCC that the IPCC cites from the social sciences is small, then the IPCC is underrepresenting social sciences. We show that this is actually not the case, and rather a randomly selected paper on climate change published in the social sciences is more likely to be cited by the IPCC than one in the natural sciences. And actually, there are some topics that are relevant to working group 3, so relevant to mitigation, which are badly represented in IPCC reports and have little social science research on them. And this can help provide a kind of agenda for social science research on climate solutions, such as hydrogen, biochar, and all these kind of technical things that maybe need more social science research in order to make this kind of research ready for inclusion in the IPCC. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is a project we did on climate impacts research. So the starting point was this map from AR5 in the second working group report on AR5, where we have the same challenges with big literature. The IPCC is trying to provide a comprehensive assessment, but doing this is really hard when we have hundreds of thousands of papers, and sometimes we can't account very well for uncertainty about what literature is available. And interestingly, behind this data lies some interesting tabular data where we have papers, and these papers are annotated by experts. And we thought maybe we can use this for doing some more interesting supervised machine learning. So how could we do this in a simple way? Just to show you how we can treat text as data. We can turn a text, in this case, an abstract about climate change, into features by taking the frequency of terms in a text and weighing that by the inverse document frequency. So basically, terms that appear very frequently in the corpus are weighed lower than terms that are improvements. And then we can use fairly simple machine learning techniques like support vector machines to fit a hyperplane in this feature space of terms that best separates the classes that we have. But with support vector machines, we ignore word order and context, and we can do more fancy stuff than that with the big advances that we've had in natural language processing recently. So BERT is the most prominent example of this kind of big breakthrough in terms of how we approach classification tasks. And the way it works is that we have a language model which is first trained on a semi-supervised task, which is predicting missing words which have been hidden in texts in extremely large corpora like all of Wikipedia. And this results in a way of representing texts and a model which can be fine-tuned to perform any other classification task. So this is what we want to do in this study. So what we did is we did a broad search in literature databases. We hand screen and code thousands of documents. We combine this training data with the categories that we got from the AR5 table. Then we use machine learning, supervised machine learning, to predict whether the documents are relevant to climate impacts and what type of impact they describe and what is driving that impact. We use some named entity recognition to extract geographical locations. And we map the entities to grid cells, and then we can describe evidence gluts and gaps at the grid cell level. So we do this all in a nice platform that we've developed at NCC. And this is what the task looks like for a human. You have lots of different things that you need to click on. Yeah. I'll skip this a little bit because I'm running out of time. But what we do for training and validation is that we want to use nested cross-validation, which basically validates the hyperparameter optimization procedure itself rather than a particular set of hyperparameters, and this prevents against overfitting. And the interesting thing about this study is that we combined the literature with other information about the locations that the literature is describing. So building on work developed by Tom Knudsen and his co-authors at NOAA, we can attribute trends in temperature or precipitation to human influence on the climate if those trends are significantly different from natural variability, and if they are consistent with modeled trends in climate models with anthropogenic forcing. We also map the documents to grid cells, and we distribute those documents among the grid cells that they are describing. And now to the results. We found that Distelbert outperformed support vector machines in all metrics by quite a lot. Still, we didn't have this F1 score of 0.71 means that on average about 70% of the documents that were predicted to be relevant were actually relevant, and 70% of the documents that were actually relevant were predicted to be relevant. So we have big uncertainties and large errors here. But this is a really complicated task, saying, is something related to the observed impacts of climate change or not? What the system was better at doing was distinguishing between different types of systems in which the impacts occurred. So between coastal and marine ecosystems or human and managed systems, etc. What this gives us was a set of documents of just over 100,000, plus or minus quite a large amount, which we can attribute to these different systems and the different continents. We can map these across all continents and see kind of some interesting variations between research foci in the different continents. So for example, in North America, terrestrial ecosystems are most frequently studied. While in Africa, that's also the case, but not to the same extent. And human and managed systems are much more frequently studied proportionally. We update Tom Knudsen's work with an additional observational record. And what this filling in this gap shows that we can actually attribute temperature rises to human influence on the climate in almost everywhere for which we have sufficient data. And when we pull this all together, then we get the following graph where we kind of merge the maps that we've seen before. So basically, in this graph here, where a cell is pink of any shade, then that means that there is an attributable trend in temperature or precipitation. Where it's dark pink, then there is lots of research, and where it's gray, then there is not an attributable trend, either because of lack of data or because the trend is not outside natural variability. And where the shade is dark, then that means we have lots of evidence. Where it's light, we have little evidence. And basically the kind of difference between the colors shows us where the distribution of study evidence kind of doesn't match evidence of where we know the climate has changed. So basically in Europe, where almost everywhere in Europe has an attributable trend in temperature, we have lots of evidence about how those temperature rises are affecting other systems. Whereas in large parts of Africa, although we know that the climate is changing, we don't have so much evidence about how those changes are affecting other systems. So we can highlight this as a really important research gap. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there because I'm running out of time. But to kind of sum up a little bit, talked a little bit about ways that machine learning can inform and support global environmental assessments. Machine reading the literature can quantify kind of hunches about what is in the literature and how subjects are treated in assessments. And there's also a large space for machine learning and evidence synthesis technology, but this requires careful thinking around applications and practical uses outside controlled experiments. And just this final point that I added as Rupam was speaking about GAMI, I think machine learning can well support but not replace expert review. As such, it's a kind of, you could call it a dangerous supplement, so to say, where, for example, I think if we could quite well classify whether a document was about adaptation, but I think trying to classify whether the document was dealing with incremental or transformation adaptation would be well outside what we can do. So machine learning can both make more screening possible. It can allocate screening resources in better ways. There are also risks we need to think about of whether we are misallocating or allocating resources in biased ways. And I think we should also be humble about the extent to which we can do automation in this area, because I think machine learning can be a complement, but definitely not a substitute for expertise. Okay, so thanks very much for your attention and also for inviting me.
Great. So we're going to hop over to some questions now. Let me just share the screen. Perfect. Wait. Okay. So thanks so much for both of your presentations. This was extremely enlightening. And we have a bunch of questions. Some of these have been submitted when people signed up, and some of them have also been entered directly into the chat. And I know you also answered some of these questions in your respective talks. So we'll try to focus on some of the novel questions first. And so this is kind of a meta-reflective question for you, Dr. Shukla, about the process of working with GAMI as a social scientist, and compared to the other research syntheses that you have conducted manually, the old-fashioned way. How has a tool like GAMI changed the social dynamics of actually doing climate change research syntheses with other collaborators?
Yeah, thank you so much. That seems like a meta question to me. It's very reflective. I don't know if I have a direct answer. So there's a lot of, working with, like I said, working with the corpus that was selected using, which was machine learning assisted, was something that was, I feel in terms of the time that was invested, that ways it was very efficient. But while we were coding as social scientists, there were a lot of questions that kept coming to our mind, that why is this paper selected? Is it something that is relevant, or is it missing on something which is, so there were a lot of questions on biases that came to my mind when I was coding these selected papers, like in terms of what's reported, or because we worked with a set of, we worked with the abstract, and we worked with a set of questions that we had to code for. And then when we were trying to answer this, it was always, there was always a bias of what I understood about that question. Then complementing that with what other coders were doing was something that was a little, I would say, challenging. And then how the whole collaborative process, a little reflection on that was that, of course, like I said, it was an amazing experience for someone like me, coming from, I would say I'm not an expert in this field. So learning a lot from how they are seeing the science happening, what questions they're asking, and how do we engage in such a big collaborative work, how discussions are happening. So there was a lot of soft learning for me during this process as well. So yeah, I hope I've answered this, in some way.
Yeah, and I see Max has his hand up, so I'm going to let Max respond there.
Yeah, I think just reflecting on that question, I think it's important to be able to reflect on how you design the machine learning system according to the different costs involved in different types of errors. Like what we tried to do, the procedure that we followed meant that every document that was included had been included by a person and not by a machine. So the machine only excluded studies, so to speak. And I think in different contexts, you have different kind of dangers of false negatives and false positives. And I think thinking about the application of machine learning in that way is really important, because it can be tempting to say, okay, and then we do machine learning and something magic happens, but actually some of the concepts that we need to understand about different types of errors are really graspable for social scientists. I mean, speaking really as a social scientist myself, most of all, and I think reflecting on those together is really important part of the process.
Dr. Shukla? I saw that you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, so I have a question for Max. I don't know if this is the right time, or maybe we can.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay. So yeah, thank you, Max, for the great presentation. It's nice to know the methods and the techniques behind, how things are done, and understand a bit of that as well. What I understood from your presentation is that a lot of the information that we get, or the things that we analyze, is frequency based in terms of what's reported maximum in words or in the text. So the question that came to my mind was that, so there are a lot of things that are less reported. And how does one account for what's being missed? Because in a way, I would say that, it's equated to what's being missed. And how do we, in a way, make it participatory? Because I think one way to move forward with AI and ML is also to make sure that, we make what's missed participatory. And the ranking of these frequencies is something, it's not ranked by us or computer, but by communities who are facing this risk. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think it needs some more empirical research to answer it. But basically, I mean, what I tried to show in the first part of the presentation was how you can set a threshold of an acceptable proportion of papers to miss. So if you use machine learning, you will always miss papers, but we can say, how can we set a threshold of an acceptable proportion of papers to miss, and be confident that we won't exceed that threshold? That's something we can do. I think that's an important feature of, AI safety, you could almost call it. I think the other question is, okay, let's say you miss 5% of the relevant documents. Which 5% is it? And are those studies coming from particular underrepresented areas? Are they somehow different? Are they by scholars from institutes or research institutes that have less kind of capital or power? Like, are these kinds of, what is being missed is also as important as how much is being missed. It's something that I want to try to find the way to analyze a little bit, but at the moment I don't know, but it's a really important question to try to ask and answer.
And I think, we actually have a related question, which was submitted when people were signing up, which is, how can we overcome the keywords bias if we run large bibliometric searches? And I think even though the question is, maybe more focused on just bibliometric searches, it also has direct relevance to the sort of whittling down or the, establishing of foci when you are doing these large scale reviews. So choosing which words or which topics are, labeled initially. And I was just wondering if you could reflect on that very human challenge of deciding, what information is novel and how to get around the keywords bias.
Maybe the question asker, I'm not sure what the word keyword, I haven't heard the phrase keywords bias, so maybe we can the asker could expand on what that means. I don't know.
Yeah, let's see. We'll keep the chat open and see if they chime in. And also, while we're waiting for that, we have another question by Scott Patterson, which is related to the use of machine learning as sort of a tool to or a dialogue tool in the review process by students. So, is there a role and opportunity here for students when they're reading and taking notes and annotating climate change text and research projects through coursework to actually integrate this evidence synthesis into, for instance, university classes or courseware?
Maybe if I can start on that, I think, not that I know of, but it's a really cool idea. I think, yeah, I think it would be really interesting. There are several challenges. I think data availability, like the way that data is structured and made available, scientific data, is really makes it not amenable to that. So bibliographic databases are hard to access, expensive to access, and give limited access. We often use abstracts instead of full text. So that's all on the publisher side. On the kind of labeling side, I think it's really hard to have a common ontology of climate things. I think we are somewhere there with the IPCC. So they give us types of categories like sectors, and we all agree that these are the 6 IPCC sectors for mitigation. These are the sectors in adaptation. Those kinds of things help us a little bit, but they're not like as tightly defined as in the health sciences, for example. And I think looking towards the health sciences, where they are quite a few years ahead of climate science, not just in the use of kind of machine learning tools, but also in the kind of culture of standardization and like evidence synthesis in general. I think that would be a helpful place to look. But yeah, I think it's a really cool idea. But
yeah, and I think we'll, in the interest of time, try to wrap up here. We have, I think, an interesting question to conclude with, and this is one that has, I think, direct relevance, especially as we think about the future of the IPCC assessments. And so, the question goes along the lines of this, that currently IPCC assessments synthesize an immense amount of information, but they are only released periodically. So they require, an immense international lift for a momentary spike in attention that can easily be diverted by, for instance, other global disasters. So there's a huge amount of work that goes into releasing a document, which in many cases can be, missed in the news cycle. What role might AI and ML fill in informing a near continuous assessment or bridging between assessments of the climate science literature as it's being produced? And what might be some of the hidden risks in doing so? And I think that question goes to both of you. So you could jump. I know it's a big question.
Yeah. If Max would like to respond to this first, or I can just share my brief understanding about this. Yeah, so I fully agree with this question and the whole process of IPCC being, episodic kind of, there's episodic push to these conversations around climate change, climate adaptation, mitigation, and then things dilute a little bit when 4 years down when the reports are released. So I mean, I think it will be nice to have, maybe what I can see is that, maybe have a portal where all of these new relevant things, something like what Max was showing in terms of his impact attribution, climate impact attribution, these maps are updated regularly, and that information needed by whosoever, policymakers or students or researchers, that is available. And the literature that is coming on daily basis now is kind of integrated and is finding space. I don't know if one can do it in an individual capacity. That would be a big task. So maybe having a sub team from IPCC to do this would be a great thing. And I think it will be a super useful thing for all of us.
Thanks, Dr. Shukla. And Max, do you have any concluding thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the IPCC is interested in doing this. I think I agree that, like, in the news cycle, maybe the IPCC gets lost, but I think that the IPCC does some things really well, because I think people do refer to the IPCC as like a source of truth, like as a kind of single source of truth on climate issues. And I think if they could update certain things, that would be really great. So if you said, well, how big is the carbon budget? How much carbon budget have we got left? If you go to the IPCC report, then it's how much we had left last year, but actually every year we're running out and it changes. And it would be nice if you could say, okay, IPCC, how much carbon budget is there left? That would be super, for example. And I think thinking of things like this, where the IPCC can remain like a consultable source of truth on certain issues, like also in mitigation, for example, like do battery electric vehicles reduce carbon emissions? Like, this is an example that really kind of sticks with me, because there are like individual studies that say battery electric vehicles are bad for the climate, and they are the minority of studies, and as time goes on, those studies will be even more in the minority, because the electric grids will get greener. But these studies keep getting brought out by interest groups, I would say, to say, oh no, we should not go into battery electric vehicles. And obviously there are many problems with battery electric vehicles, but if the IPCC can, now the IPCC has assessed this literature and has said battery electric vehicles are good. And that's a really great step. And I hope that will change the debate a little bit. But if we could kind of constantly update this in the sense of living evidence, then I think that would be even better.
Well, I think that notion of living evidence is a nice one to end on, and certainly one that both of you have contributed to in your talks today. So thank you so much for your time and devotion to these topics and sharing this information. We want to encourage everyone in closing to continue the conversation on the climate change AI community, to brainstorm potential new applications and ideas of using some of the technologies that you heard about today. So please join us there and stay tuned for future webinars, and join me in giving a big round of applause to both Dr. Shukla and Dr. Callahan. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks again.